Welcome to Is Recovery Possible? What is the evidence? With myself, Elaine Wilkins, and I'll be introducing the team in a second. So your presenters today are myself, and we have joining us Dr. Heather Dunn, who's a health psychologist and trauma-informed wellbeing coach and recoverer. We also have Dr. Alison McGrath, who has a background in nursing and her MSc by research, PhD, and she's also trauma-informed wellbeing coach and recoverer. On the right-hand side, we have Wendy Day joining us, whose background in education and training, tutor and assessor, and she's also a trauma-informed wellbeing coach and recoverer. And then last but absolutely not least, we have Sally Ann Atkinson, who is a BSc Honours Occupational Therapy, many years in mental health wards as well, and studying wellbeing coaching, and also been through her own long COVID recovery. So that's who's going to be presenting today. Let's have a look now at what we're going to be covering. So we're going to be asking today, is recovery possible? What is the evidence? We're going to look at the prognosis that happens around ME, CFS and fibromyalgia mainly. We're going to be looking at the approaches to helping people with those illnesses. We're going to be looking at two models of healthcare. I'm going to feature a case study today. It's the ASA case study around what is valid evidence. So we're going to be looking at that. And then Dr. Dunn is going to be looking at, is recovery possible from a research perspective? Dr. McGrath is going to be talking to us about the nursing perspective on evidence in recovery. And then we have Sally looking at recovery from the current NHS occupational therapy perspective, and then we have the GP perspective from Wendy Day on the biopsychosocial approach. So we've got lots to get through today, but we promised you that we'll do that. We may run over slightly, but we'll do our very, very best. So just to begin with, the word recovery around these particular illnesses is a very, very contentious issue. People tend to fall into sort of two camps. They either believe that recovery is possible, or they're absolutely adamant that recovery isn't. And it's a very, very tricky situation for those diagnosed, because when we look at the sort of prognosis and diagnosis information that's online on patient.co.uk, it will describe ME and chronic fatigue as long-term disabling with the cause not known. MEAction.net calls it a devastating multi-system disease. And the NHS talk about these illnesses as being long-term and chronic. And if we're talking about fibromyalgia, it's considered long-term and ongoing by the NHS. So you see, that is the information that people are presented with when they start to look for information after they've had a diagnosis. And that included me. So this is a photograph of me back at my worst, back in the year 2000. And what happened, I became bedbound and I couldn't work. And the only treatment that was offered to me was antidepressants, painkillers, sleeping medication, multiple NHS referrals. And then the only thing I was sent on was an expert patients course where I was to learn how to manage symptoms. And the message was to learn to adapt to a long-term chronic condition. I literally was one of those people that believed recovery had to be possible. And so I did regain my health, but it did take me 6 years because of this kind of merry-go-round and the revolving door of the health service that I experienced. Anybody else relate to that? Do type it in the chat box. Has that been part of your story or somebody's story that you know? So at the time, the only sort of help and support that I had in the beginning was the ME Association. They're a registered charity. They currently have 5,000 paid up members, and their view is that ME/CFS is a complex and chronic medical condition, has no effective drug treatment, and full recovery is rare. I also had a book that was written by a doctor called Living with ME, and it described the illness as a living death. You can imagine how terrifying I felt that information was. And, you know, I don't know if there's anyone on here today that's had similar things said to them. So the ME Association say that they spend a lot of their time and effort working with scientists on new research grants, because funding good quality biomedical research is a key priority for this charity. So the ME Association only invest in essential biomedical research, looking for effective treatments. And so the idea is that full recovery is rare, and the research focus and the answer to this is biomedical research. I did recover after 6 years, and recovery is my absolute passion. So after 15 years of recovery focused work in ME, CFS and fibromyalgia and post-viral fatigue, it's always been this very difficult, contentious issue between recovery and, you know, the common findings online and in books written about this. It always seems to be that recovery isn't possible. But over the years of doing this work, our work became sort of evidenced, and we have accumulated lots of awards along the way, and our work is accredited by FHT and ILM in terms of our training and information. Because of that, we ran conferences, and we do continue to run conferences every year. And in 2016, we invited the ME Association and Action for ME to attend a conference in 2016. That year, we had our ambassador, Anna Hemmings, MBE, who's keynote speaker, who'd recovered from ME, chronic fatigue syndrome herself, and had gone on to win 3 more gold medals. And so I was really excited that the ME Association would be there to be able to meet up with lots of people that had recovered, and also meet Anna herself. But the ME Association declined that invitation, as did Action for ME. Fast forward to October 2022, and the ME Association raised a complaint about the work that we do at the Chrysalis Effect. And this was sent through to the Advertising Standards Authority, and I'll tell you about those in a moment. So the ME Association challenged whether the efficacy claims that the Chrysalis Effect programme could treat ME CFS were misleading and could be substantiated. Well, the first thing we did to that complaint was refuted the word treat. It does not appear in anything that we've ever said about the kind of work that we do to support people in their recovery, and it never has. So that was then changed by the Advertising Standards Authority. They accepted that. And so the complaint was amended to us being able to substantiate whether the Chrysalis Effect could aid recovery, and saying that whether that was misleading. So the ASA, just to let you know if you've not come across them, are the Advertising Standards Authority, and they're the UK's independent regulator of advertising all across the media. So they have to apply the advertising codes, and that's called the CAP code. So the ASA considered that consumers would understand claims that the Chrysalis Effect programme could be and had been successfully used to aid ME CFS recovery. They wanted to see whether they thought that was misleading. So the CAP code required that objective claims like those must be backed by evidence, if relevant, consisting of trials conducted on people. Well, we were really excited about that because we've got lots and lots of evidence. The difficulty came with the evidence that the ASA would accept, as opposed to the evidence that we have. So that problem occurs because there are 2 models of healthcare. So the acute disease model, which is the biomedical model, which the ME Association favour, captures certain types of evidence, doesn't it? So we know that the biomedical model is external experts, doctors, consultants, GPs, and they treat symptoms, they do lots of testing, they're looking at the efficacy of medication, and of course they'll perform surgery. So I think of that type of healthcare model as a tool. And so just like this tool here, this colander, this tool will filter and only capture some of what goes in. So, this is a tool that filters something precious, and it only captures some of what goes in there. With the biopsychosocial model, what evidence does that capture? Well, it's very, very different. This is the biopsychosocial model, and you'll see that it looks at the biology, so gender, disability, physical health, neurochemistry, stress reactivity. It looks at the psychological impact for people, so behavior, personality, attitudes, beliefs, learning and memory, coping and social skills, self-esteem and emotions. It also looks at the social aspect. So it really takes a holistic view. So education, social support, peer relationships, family background, socioeconomic status, and importantly, family relationships and life events. It looks at things like trauma and everything that's happened to somebody from childhood to adulthood. So what underpins the biopsychosocial model is health coaching, and it's central to discovery, which leads to recovery. So you can see it's more complex. It looks at a whole host of things. So if we can use that analogy of a tool, and we've got here a water butt here, so this tool captures every drop of that precious stuff, doesn't it? And what we know is the biopsychosocial approach takes a 360-degree and it looks at root causes. So very, very different model of healthcare. So when we collect evidence from people that are working on their recovery, we're looking at the whole story, that biopsychosocial approach. So with over 5,000 health profiles since 2009, we've been generating qualitative and quantitative evidence measuring those results. So what that means is that we're capturing people's thoughts, feelings about their capacity, their level of wellness, and we're also catching quantitative, so that we've got measurements of pain, anxiety, activities of daily living to see how they change over time as someone recovers. What those evidence give us is progress reviews, 3, 6 and 9 month intervals. So we can see percentage improvements. So we're very excited to submit that evidence to the ASA. So we submitted about 35 pages, and that consisted of peer-reviewed literature on BPS approach and recovery from CFS, symptom impact questionnaires, health profiles, video and written recovery testimonials. And at the time, we were running NHS pilots for fibromyalgia, long COVID, and ME. And because the NICE guidelines say that the NHS can bring in specialist services, and that's what we are. And also, we were being evaluated by Oxford University. So we were very confident when we went into submitting that evidence. These are photographs of many of the people that have we've supported to recovery over the 15 years of measurable recovery. But when we submitted the evidence, every recovery story was invalidated as evidence. As we told each person's story and admitted those testimonies, those videos, these are before and after photographs, all of that. These people had all had medical diagnoses, been unable to work, been bedbound, and are now symptom-free and working. Invalid as evidence. This is Rachel Wright. We submitted her evidence as well. You can see all the symptoms and things that Rachel had. She was in the NHS herself as a paediatric dietitian and had become seriously ill with all of those symptoms. And she was sent for scans, offered medication, that acute disease model approach, electrical conductivity tests for multiple sclerosis. All the tests came back clear, but she was told once she was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome that it would be lifelong and life-limiting. Here's Rachel after she went through and recovered with the Chrysalis Effect, and here's her testimonial of how she's got a quality of life back, more energy than she's ever had in years, with complete recovery, and dreads to think where she would be without that biopsychosocial approach. Her evidence was invalidated. So this means that my recovery also has been invalidated as evidence of recovery, and I've been fully recovered now for 17 years. So the ASA ruling the complaint was upheld. And what we learned was that substantiation would be assessed on the basis of available scientific knowledge. And they said we considered that meant the Chrysalis Effect should hold scientific evidence in support of the claims that their programme could aid recovery of ME CFS. So the evidence that we submitted was not acceptable. The testimonies were not acceptable. Did you realise that organisations like us who work in the recovery field are unable to mention the illness, condition or symptoms, or that their organisation can aid recovery in any way? And Google, Instagram, Facebook, etc. can face huge penalties if an advertiser runs an ad that breaches the CAP code. When the ASA ruled against us, that means that for 6 years, when anyone Googles the name of our organisation, up will come that the complaint was made and it was upheld. And we were asked to sign an assurance. So that means we had to agree to ensure that we do not make claims that our programme can aid in ME CFS recovery or full clinical recovery from ME CFS unless we hold sufficient evidence to support those claims. And that is the position we find ourselves in. So what are your thoughts about the invalidity of patient experience in evidence-based healthcare? We'd love to know on here what your thoughts are now I've gone through that. And also, how do you feel about not having the information that recovery is possible because organisations aren't allowed to let you know that online or on their websites? So I'd like to hand over to Heather now, who's going to be looking at, is recovery possible from a research perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. So so I'm coming at this from a perspective as a former nurse, over 15 years experience in nursing and as an NHS health trainer. So I come from that very medical background, but that kind of didn't sit well for me, that medical model. So I shifted into the area of health psychology, where I completed my doctorate. And health psychology is the study of behaviour change that promotes health and well-being. And that's a very biopsychosocial approach. I'm also coming from the perspective with my research hat on. So I was an associate lecturer, taught research methods and statistics, and supervised student research projects for people doing health psychology and psychology at undergraduate and at master's level. And then I had an accumulation of 10 years experience in total working as a university researcher, doing clinical trials that Elaine talked about, that biomedical model, and various other approaches to research. And today, what I'd like to focus on are 3 questions from a research perspective around recovery. So the first one we're going to look at is, how would researchers define recovery? We need to have a definition of recovery to be able to research it. Then we're going to look at how best what methods we can use within research to establish recovery from chronic fatigue is possible. And then we're going to look at the evidence within existing research to see whether or not recovery is actually possible. So in answer to that first area that we would explore, one of the first things you do in research is you come up with the definition of what it is that your research question is. In this case, is recovery possible? So we utilise in research various search engines specifically for research. And Medline is one of those, and that's very much for a health-related research perspective. And that definition, when I looked that one up, was the act of regaining or returning towards a normal or healthy state. Now, the important thing here with that definition is that the act of regaining or returning towards is not an end, it's a process. So it doesn't determine the need for an actual measure that says this is recovery, that recovery has been achieved. It's the act of regaining or returning towards a normal healthy state. And that's within a Medline definition. The next thing I'd do from a research perspective is I'd look at the existing research and see if there are any different definitions within the specific area. So because long COVID is relatively recent and the research takes a few years to come through, what I'm going to focus on here today is the research around ME and CFS. And in a systematic review of 22 research studies into recovery from ME CFS, what they came to the conclusion was that there isn't a consistent definition. But what they recommended is a broad-based return to health, which is that Medline definition, that act of regaining or returning towards a normal healthy state, with assessments of both fatigue and function. And as Elaine mentioned, those are the quantitative measures, as well as the patient's perceptions of his or her recovery. And what Elaine was saying is that the patient's perceptions have been invalidated. But from a research perspective, when you look at the definition of research in terms of chronic fatigue and ME recovery, the patient's perceptions are part of the definition. So they shouldn't be invalidated. And anybody that suggests that they are is actually suggesting that any research that takes into consideration patients' perceptions is invalid. So I think that's really important, and I'd like to think about that. Then what we would be doing is we would be looking at the methods of how we would research into chronic fatigue ME. And this is a clinical trials versus a complex service evaluations, because what we know is that clinical trials are very much on that biomedical model that Elaine talked about, whereas a complex service evaluation is more fitting for a biopsychosocial approach. And we've had consultations with two established and very prominent research universities in England that have suggested that complex service evaluations are the better approach for research into ME and chronic fatigue and into the programs such as ours. So in a clinical trial, for example, an intervention might be a medication to treat pain versus the placebo, so a sugar pill, and the outcome would be the level of pain. Whereas in a complex program such as ours, you've got multiple independent variables. As Elaine mentioned, we've got the health-related coaching, we've got the educational content, we've got all of the things within the recovery pathway that are too diverse to actually mention right now. There are so many actual independent variables that affect the outcome, which is recovery. So the complex service evaluation approach is the most appropriate approach. So suggesting that clinical trials on people, which is what the ASA and the ME Association suggested, from a research perspective, it is invalid. Also, when we look at the definition of funding of recovery and research, and we're looking at having quantitative and qualitative data, clinical trials tend not to have that person perspective, that qualitative data. Also within universities, what you find is that there's lots of research funding for clinical trials. And when you think that a lot of the trials are conducted on medications, the funding is from pharma. And pharma have a vested interest in people staying ill, because if they are well and they are recovered, then they're not going to take the medication. And so they will promote clinical trials that will enhance the argument that recovery isn't possible. Whereas complex service evaluations look at that biopsychosocial perspective. So universities, there's very little funding for complex service evaluations and much more funding for clinical trials. So that's why there's very little research out there. So is recovery possible from a research perspective? The evidence is yes. There's evidence that recovery is possible in children as well as in adults, and the ADAM, which one on adults, encompassed 22 research studies that we saw. So those papers show that recovery is possible. And what the research suggests is that recovery rates vary, but that anything between 2 months and 2 years follow-up should be done within research to establish if recovery is possible. And we can see from the recovery stories that we've got lots of people who have recovered well in advance of that 2-year margin. Also, there is research to show that the biopsychosocial approach and the educational programs such as our pathway can support recovery. And the evidence here, these programs such as ours compare very favourably with those clinically based interventions such as CBT. And more generically within research on CBT for lots of different kinds of health conditions, beyond 12 months, CBT interventions can fall off in their effectiveness. So when you look at psychoeducational interventions such as ours and you see that recovery is possible way beyond that 12-month, it's important to sort of conduct research that has a longer follow-up to establish whether or not a psychoeducational intervention is more effective than perhaps CBT. And also the observation studies using a much more qualitative approach show just as much effectiveness as clinical trials. So if you combine those two methodologies, which is suggested in the definition of recovery from a research perspective, you're going to get really good positive results that recovery is possible. And as Elaine's already mentioned, the NHS pilots were with the Chrysalis Effect showed that they were confident enough in the pathway to adopt it as a rolling referral pathway, which shows that it met all those rigorous requirements of the NHS. So if it can meet those requirements, then they're confident that recovery is possible. If you're still not convinced, then this is my perspective, which according to the definition in research is valid in terms of research. So I had very similar symptoms to those that we saw in Rachel's case study that Elaine presented earlier. I was a functional human being having an active life, and I was a researcher at a university in Sheffield. But my cognitive symptoms that started to kick in really affected my work. I wasn't able to concentrate. I couldn't remember faces. I couldn't do my job. So after 6 months of being off work, I was finally diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I had all the physical symptoms as well as the cognitive symptoms. And all I was offered at the point of diagnosis was 2 half-days pacing to learn to live with the condition, which, as Elaine said earlier, I was told there was no cure and to just get on with it. I actually had thought I'd got early onset dementia at the beginning, and I was terrified. But what it led me to have to do was to go back to work part-time. I suspended my PhD studies. I wasn't able to do that. And then eventually in 2019, I left work altogether. It wasn't until 2020 when I found the Chrysalis Effect online. And in January, I started the 9-month pathway. And by the end of that, I'd had a 76% improvement in my symptoms. And when you consider that 14% is clinically significant, this was huge for me. And this is what recovery looks like for me today. So I've got my life back. I went back, I returned to do my PhD studies. I got married in 2021. It's my wedding anniversary today. And that's a 3-year wedding anniversary, and I've been recovered all that time. I'm actively doing all the things you can see in this picture. And from my perspective, I'm fully recovered. And from a research perspective, that's considered to be valid.
Thank you so much, Heather. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Alison McGrath, please, a nursing perspective on the evidence of recovery.
Hello. So yes, I'm Alison, and like Heather, I'm a former nurse. I'm not in practice anymore, and I'm a recoverer. And I want to talk a little bit about my perspective on evidence and research as somebody who actually became ill through being a nurse, but also my recovery was hugely influenced by my belief that it was possible and my understanding of what counts as evidence and what was worth actually trying out. So this is me on the left as a young nurse. Just finished my training, and I had quite an unusual training. Heather said that hers was quite biomedical. Mine was at the University of Edinburgh within the social sciences faculty. And we were taught an approach to nursing which was based very much in holistic care. So always we were told that we had to see the whole person in front of us, not just the diagnosis. I mean, the way things were that in the past, that people would talk about diabetic in bed 3 or something like that. That was absolutely out for us. It was always the whole person. And as nurses, we were taught that our role was about empowerment and support and advocacy as well as care. So at the heart of it was that we should never actually be doing anything for a patient that they could do for themselves. We were there to help them to get back to independence and that sense of wholeness, which is the root of the word healing. But that also sometimes that we needed to be advocates within an NHS system that can be really dehumanizing. We were to stand by the patients if necessary and argue their case and help them to express themselves. And often that was in the situation where we were doing that with medical staff. So we were taught not necessarily to believe everything that the doctor said and to question them. We were taught that nursing essentially was about healing rather than cure. So rather than doing things to people, we were helping them to become whole. And I can remember being taught about Florence Nightingale, who back at the sort of late 19th century, when she was establishing modern nursing, her assertion was that only nature cures, and that the role of a nurse is to remove the barriers to the body's natural, innate ability to heal itself. And that as nurses, that's what we should be doing. And for her, a lot of that was around the environment and hygiene. So she talked about fresh air, good food. I think she talked about views from the window. So there's a psychological dimension as well. And being surrounded by people who support you. So feeling safe and well supported. And that really shaped the way I view health and healing and nursing to this day, and fits really, really well with my work now as a practitioner with the Chrysalis Effect. The fourth point on this slide is much more of a negative one. The others are all focused on the patient and what the patient needs. One of the things that was in the hidden curriculum in nursing was that nursing is about self-sacrifice. So as a healer, I have to be the strong one who's always there for other people. And there was no scope there at all for being ill myself or for looking after myself. And that was the element of nursing that really took me into fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, and the point where I actually had to leave nursing behind and had years and years and years of mounting symptoms. So next slide here. This cartoon I absolutely loved when I was a student nurse because I had it up above my desk and it just encapsulated for me what I was supposed to be doing, which was always asking why. So I saw myself as this little student nurse standing at the foot of this terrified patient's bed, asking questions. If you can move it on, Elaine. Always at the heart of what we were trained to do was to look for evidence-based practice. So why are we doing this? Does it work? Is there proof that it works? Always. And never to just take things on sort of traditional terms. But we were also trained to ask, why is this happening? So not just looking at the symptoms, but looking at the root causes of where the symptoms were coming from. And I think this is interesting when we look at medicine, as Heather was talking about, the medical approach. We're used to talking about palliative care in terms of end of life and death, but actually palliative means alleviating symptoms. So there is an argument there for saying that all of medicine is palliative because it's based on a model in which they identify symptoms and they put them together in patterns to make a diagnosis and then have a treatment, which again is focused on the symptoms. Now, for us as nurses, it was, well, why have you got those symptoms in the first place? So when I started to get ill, those were the questions I was asking, and I was dismissed constantly by doctors and found it really hard to actually get referrals. So as I said, I was always going back, asking questions of the doctors, being prepared to challenge them. And when I was told that I had fibromyalgia and there was no cure and I had to learn to adapt, instead of giving up in hopelessness, I got really angry because my questions weren't being answered. And I knew enough from my clinical training to be able to see some of the likely pathways that were happening underneath my symptoms. And that really, that nurse training, I think, is what saved me because it kept my hope alive and it kept me asking those questions all the time. and giving me energy through anger, which otherwise I wouldn't have had. And that took me from a situation where I had to give up all of my work. I was completely dependent on my husband, and on a couple of occasions I was taken into hospital with cardiac symptoms, to the picture that you see on the left here, which was last month when I'm doing a kayaking course. So I was doing deep water rescues, hauling kayaks out of the water and across my knee to empty them. So I've been completely symptom-free now for the last 2 years. I'm hill walking, I'm gardening, I've set up a business as a coach and a wellbeing specialist. And I'm sharing what I've learned now with my clients to help them to follow that same pathway through. So this is a picture of me after I left nursing. I went back to university to do my master's in research and then a PhD. And my area of speciality is in workforce studies. So I was in the School of Health and Social Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. So I had a really good grounding in what is scientific and what's not. And from that, I was very well aware as we went through the ASA investigation that the assertion that they have that recovery is impossible is profoundly unscientific, because scientific principles state that you can't prove a negative. So in order to prove a negative, you would have to look at absolutely every example of anybody who'd been ill and prove that they hadn't recovered, and then continue doing that into the future. And obviously that's not possible. The reverse of that is when you make a positive statement, you only need one example of something to prove that it exists. So in this context, a single recoverer like myself or Heather or Sally or Wendy or Elaine, one single recoverer is evidence that recovery is real and possible. And that this actually within scientific approach to thinking should be the starting point for investigation. So we proved that one is possible, somebody exists. So let's look at that and see how they did it and why. And there are many, many ways to investigate a scientific hypothesis. But the Advertising Standards Authority and the medical profession insist on focusing on these randomized controlled trials, which, as Heather has shown, are completely inappropriate to what we do. But then they dismiss any other possibilities at all. And I think it's really important there to think about that scientific method. So at the moment, we are being dismissed as outliers within the sort of quantitative approach to research. So we disrupt the pattern. So the major pattern is that most people don't recover because most people, as we would say it, are not being given the answers and the support they need to do that. But that our existence should be the starting point for actually doing more research, which is not being done at the moment. And I think it's really interesting to look at where the Chrysalis effect came from here, is that Elaine has followed the scientific method. So Elaine recovered, so she knew that it was possible. And she went out because she wanted to be able to help other people to do this. And she found other people who'd recovered, and she interviewed them, found out what it was they all had in common, and used that as the basis for the Chrysalis effect. That is a deeply scientific approach to a problem. And it's rooted in the origins of medical science, which was in clinicians who did exactly that. They saw patterns in their clients and they formed hypotheses and they adapted their practice to see what would help and what would not. And from that, Elaine's original research has helped thousands and thousands of people ever since. But we don't have those peer-reviewed journal evidence articles specifically looking at the Chrysalis effect, because what is seen as scientific truth is shaped by power and ideology as much as research. So as Heather said, there's a question here of what gets funded and why. And nobody will fund the research into what we're doing here. So there will continue to be a lack of evidence in the form that it's presented. So I'd just like to conclude that to anybody who's listening to this, who is in these kind of fields, don't dismiss us as outliers, just come and study us. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Alison. Yeah, do put your responses in the chat box. We're really interested in your responses to each speaker's presentation. So thank you so much, Alison. And I think next we have Sally Atkinson.
So in today, I'm going to focus on where we are now in recovery, because I am currently working as a clinician, as a specialist occupational therapist in the NHS. I have over 18 years experience working in mental health. I currently work in A&E, where I see people in mental health crisis, and quite a significant proportion of those also have symptoms of fatigue, ME, and fibromyalgia. I also set up a recovery service in the NHS sort of about 10 years ago, looking at mental health recovery. And like I say, I'm currently working in A&E as an occupational therapist. I'm a recoverer from long COVID myself, which I did with the Chrysalis Effect. I was put on NHS trials through work. The aims of today's presentation are to look at my professional and personal experience to show you that modern definitions of recovery are more than a cure. And that also I'd like to introduce the concept that ME and CFS could be seen as similar to mental health in that the cause of the illness is complex and contextual. And so therefore we need a multifaceted approach for treatment of ME and CFS. So looking at the modern definitions of recovery from the dictionary, recovery is a restoration of health, so following illness and therapeutic intervention to a former or better state. It does not mention cure in recovery. It's a process of change. So it's about individuals improving their health and wellness, living a self-directed life, and striving to reach their full potential. And it's about regaining a normal state, as if to recover from a fright. We are starting to see these broader definitions used in medically dominated areas. So, for example, I work in A&E, and we are starting to see that a more holistic approach is being used. OTs like myself are now placed in A&E departments, and physios and social workers, looking at that whole person, because often when somebody comes in with a physical illness, it's also related to other factors as well. Out of interest, in nuclear recovery, it refers to a process of energy extraction, in particular, like a magnetic resonance and regaining a control to a situation. So going on to mental health definitions, I believe that changes in perspectives in the definitions of recovery in mental health are useful and applicable to considering recovery in CFS. So historically, mental health recovery, it was seen that there was no cure to mental health problems. People were locked away in institutions and medicated to reduce their problems. It was considered that it was always in the mind, and that it was separate to the body, but it's now acknowledged that the mind and body there is a link. So for example, in mental health, it can be caused by inflammation and genetics, and it is also influenced by those psychological and social factors such as environment and relationship, and the things that Elaine and Alison and the others have been talking about. So the focus has shifted away in mental health from problems to a person's strengths and resources to live a meaningful life. And perhaps in time, a similar thing will happen with chronic fatigue. So yeah, recovery is a process. And it's about being as well as you can be. It doesn't mean the absence of illness. And in fact, in the community mental health teams, we're actually called recovery services now, going away from that acute model and believing that it happens at home. Recovery is also a non-linear process. There's ups and downs, relapses, and it's about being as well as you can be. It's unique to the individual. It's about individual, sorry. It's about empowerment and personal responsibility, and that link to sort of regaining control, like in the definition of the nuclear recovery. It's about hope, and peer support is used a lot in mental health recovery, and it's about well-being and feeling good. And often in our mental health services, at least, they're all trauma-informed recovery services. And we're encouraged to see, and I'm encouraged to see that those perspectives are definitely being acknowledged in the medical area now. So occupational therapy and recovery. So occupational therapists are often seen as key people in enabling recovery and rehabilitation, because we use that biopsychosocial approach, which is holistic, similar to what Alison was talking about, being person-centered, focusing on independence and empowerment, and focusing on strengths and solutions rather than problems. And we do have this key role in recovery services in the NHS. So, for example, in ME and CFS services in the NHS, often OTs are very prominent in those areas and seen in a very favourable way, because of the way we look at complexity, chronic illnesses, and identifying solutions that enable you to function in activity that is meaningful to you. And this is one of the things that appealed to me when I was introduced to the Chrysalis Effect, was the similarities between the Chrysalis Effect approach and the approach used by occupational therapists and modern definitions of recovery. So just lastly, a bit about recovery in me. In April 2020, whilst working on a COVID mental health ward, I developed COVID, and in 2021, after having my COVID jab, I got long COVID. At the time, there was no research and evidence, but I needed to do something to get back to work. Luckily, I was put onto the NHS trials through my work with the Chrysalis Effect, which was great. Didn't understand it initially. I felt, but at this time, I felt quite dismissed by my GP. I was quite angry because it was suggested that this was all in my mind and it was linked to psychological factors. I then got referred to the long COVID clinic, which was great. I saw an occupational therapist, but the problem was it was slow, there was waiting lists, and it was under-resourced. And I needed to get better quickly to go back to work. But what it did is it made me more open to the fact that behavioural and psychological factors can be effective. At the time when I was ill, I wasn't able to apply my knowledge of planning, pacing, priority, prioritising to get myself better because of the brain fog. You know, I was really impaired. I couldn't dress myself and all of those things. But luckily, like I say, I had the Chrysalis Effect offered to me, and it has been really effective for my recovery. And I have to say that my quality of life and health is the best it's ever been. Here's me now. So my life is better than it's ever been, and better than I could ever be imagined, and I feel in control and empowered in my life. And for me, that is the definition of recovery.
Thank you, Sally. I love those photographs, especially that recent one of that new little grandson.
Yeah, and I can enjoy him.
Yeah,
you know, and absolutely. I wouldn't have been able to, and that's just sums it up.
No, and you know, having seen you go from you know, pretty much bedbound to out there in your shorts, digging up that allotment. It's just,
I did 5 hours of heavy work the other day.
Yeah.
I was just so happy.
Exactly. Okay, well, thank you so much for giving us that occupational therapy perspective. Really appreciate that. And then finally, our final speaker today is Wendy Day, who's going to look at recovery from a GP perspective. Hi, Wendy.
Hi everybody, good morning to you, and I'm Wendy. I'm a recoverer from chronic fatigue. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about a doctor who's really trying to lead the change, bringing in this biopsychosocial approach, which we've spoken about so much, and that is Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. So I'd like to talk a bit about him and how he's advocating for health coaching. He's considered to be one of the most influential doctors in the UK with 20 years experience. He's a prolific author, has written 5 best-selling books, an international speaker with a TED Talk, and a prolific podcaster. And he used to have a hit TV show called Doctor in the House, where he would go into his patients' homes and work with them to implement lifestyle changes. He's also been a resident doctor on BBC television and a regular contributor to BBC Radio. So he is a huge fan of the 360-degree approach to chronic health. So the holistic approach that we've spoken about, looking at the whole person. And he feels that the majority of people don't need a pill, they need a lifestyle prescription. He's also, I should mention, recently joined the University of Chester as a visiting professor in the Faculty of Health, Medicine and Society. So his progressive medicine approach involves getting to the root causes and trying to empower his patients with these simple lifestyle medicine prescriptions. And that was something that was really important to me coming in with symptoms as an educator and as a holistic therapist. I knew that I wasn't going to be happy just taking pills for my symptoms. I wanted to get to the root cause of why I was so out of balance. Dr. Chatterjee has worked with a lady called Nicola Singleton on his Doctor in the House show, and he worked with her at her home for 6 weeks. And after the 6 weeks was up and they'd made lots of lifestyle changes, she was free of her fibromyalgia symptoms. And then if you have a look on his website, drchatterjee.com, you will see that there is an interview with her there talking about not only how she was free of fibro symptoms, but she also went on to become free of her chronic fatigue symptoms by continuing to implement these lifestyle changes. So I'd like to move on now to look at how Dr. Chatterjee feels that we are still using 20th century thinking to solve 21st century problems. And what I mean by that is when the NHS was set up in the 1940s, it was mostly set up to deal with acute disease. But of course, now we have a growing number of people with chronic conditions such as fibromyalgia, long COVID, chronic fatigue and ME, and of course other issues as well, such as diabetes, cancer. And these issues, these chronic health conditions are affecting our workforce, they're affecting our communities. Our medical staff are getting exhausted with the sheer number of people that they're trying to help. And Dr. Chatterjee is trying to bring in a biopsychosocial approach similar to what we use in the Chrysalis Effect online recovery program. And he's looking at the whole person. So he wants to look at the biology of what's going on in the body, with sleep, with gut health, looking at the nervous system and tackling the stress and anxiety, and also the psychology factors around thinking about beliefs and behavior, and sociology issues around our relationships with others and the importance of having healthy connections. And he's looking at how he can balance the body systems using lifestyle interventions without the need for complete reliance on pharmaceutical drugs. So he has been working with Dr. Ayan Panja, another NHS GP, and together they have created lifestyle medical training for healthcare professionals so that they can feel more equipped to help all the patients that they see with chronic health issues, because they only have this 10-minute slot, as you know, and they often feel so ill-equipped to support their patients effectively. And they really want to be able to empower their patients to go away and be able to make changes for themselves outside of that appointment. Dr. Chatterjee has a very popular podcast called Feel Better, Live More, with about 8 million weekly listeners. And on that podcast, he interviews many groundbreaking pioneers and researchers in the field of understanding and healing chronic disease and pain. People such as Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, Howard Schubiner, and Bruce Lipton. And he also talks to many trauma-informed individuals. And we do recommend these practitioners to our clients because they're so they have done so much groundbreaking research in different approaches. So one of the really important things that Dr. Chatterjee is involved in is trying to advocate for health coaching. And health coaching is a really integral part of our online recovery program. And it helps people to build awareness around where they might need to make changes in their life, and also helps them to be supported and encouraged to do the steps that they need to take, because it's really hard to make changes on your own. And these changes can lead to significant improvements in health and well-being, as we've heard from everybody else and for myself. You know, these changes that I have made in the recovery program have led to me regaining my health. So Dr. Chatterjee is on the advisory panel for the UK and International Health Coaching Association, alongside Dr. Ellison Sabine, who has worked alongside us on one of our NHS pilots. And the UK and International Health Coaching Association has recently launched a white paper setting out the case for the integration of health coaching as a foundational platform for every sector of health in 21st century Britain. And the reason for this is that they recognise that our GPs are so overworked and they just do not have the time or the training to support patients to make changes to their lifestyle. So Dr. Chatterjee feels that health coaches are absolutely critical for the future of the nation's health, as they understand the science of behaviour change, but they also have the art of helping people to embed new, healthier habits. And you can see on YouTube Dr. Chatterjee discussing this issue. And I'd like to mention also that the Chrysalis Effect is an approved provider for UK IHCA training with our trauma-informed wellbeing coach course. So I'd just like to finish off by telling you a little bit about my recovery story. So I had 8 years of chronic fatigue before I found the Chrysalis Effect. And as many of you will resonate with, I'm sure, I was sent to all different departments of the NHS to have nerve conductivity studies done, and all sorts of different tests for digestion and just going around the houses. Basically, all my tests came back normal. I'd also had 12 years of chronic pain, and they hadn't been able to find a root cause for that either. So I'd had a really long period of testing and trying to find what was causing my symptoms. So symptoms such as fatigue, nerve and muscle problems, brain fog, and just exhaustion. And I had so much frustration and anxiety about what was causing these symptoms, and it was impacting my life so much. I had 2 children that I was having to try and save as much energy as I could for, which meant I wasn't really able to work because I needed to get them to school every day and provide for them. My husband had to cope without me a lot of the time because I had to drop out of family activities. And of course, it impacted our finances because I wasn't able to work much. So, you know, it was such a difficult time. And when I found the Chrysalis Effect program, I was so pleased and could see so much value in it, having a plan laid out for me. And I found it so empowering to hear that I could make changes myself. It was such a relief. So I started the program. I addressed all the 8 areas that we work with holistically. And after 6 months of making the changes in the program, I started to see improvement, and that led on to a full recovery for me. And so I'm now symptom free. I'm able to work, I'm able to socialize, I'm able to take part in family activities, and yes, so everything that I wasn't able to do, basically. So that is my story of recovery. I hope that you found it helpful, and thank you for listening. I'll pass back now to Elaine.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was so good to sort of see those photographs of your recovery as well, and also, you know, the wonderful work of Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. So, you know, the new generations of doctors hopefully are going to be coming through, and the model has got to change, hasn't it? It's going to become biopsychosocial eventually. We're just kind of at the pioneering stage, really. So Kelly, I know that you've got a link that you can share today. So if you've got questions or you'd like any information, Kelly's going to share a link to a contact form. So you can just click on that, fill out, let us know what questions or information that you'd like, and then we can make sure that you get information and appropriate to what you're asking. We are planning another session, which is the Chrysalis Effect recovery pathways. How do they work? So that we can actually explain what people go through in order to get from being very poorly to recovery, just like Wendy and Heather and Alison and Sally have done, of coming through the Chrysalis Effect. So do complete that contact form, or if you'd prefer to, you can just drop us an email, info@thechrysaliseffect.com, and what we'll do is we'll let you know when that next session is running, and you'd be very welcome to attend. So thank you so much for joining us today for Is Recovery Possible? What is the evidence? I hope that it's given you some insight into maybe some things you didn't realise around the types of evidence, what the Advertising Standards Authority's job is, and obviously the perspectives and the healthcare models, and the approach that we believe is required in order to ensure that people know right from the get-go that recovery is absolutely possible, and that people's life experience, lived experience, recovery experience is taken as valid evidence rather than invalidated. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're just going to stop the recording now, and if anybody does have any questions, we've got a few minutes. We can stay on till 10 past. I'll be very happy to answer them. So thanks again for joining us. And if you're watching this retrospectively, then there will be some links and some information for you to follow.